On the Soviet calendar, New Year's Eve was never just a date. It was a stage. It was a test of power, a showcase of discipline, and at the highest levels, a ritual that revealed what kind of state the USSR was becoming at any given moment. In a system built on symbols, the way Soviet leaders marked the turning of the year, whether with silence, with forced merriment, with staged abundance, or with carefully televised domesticity, was inseparable from policy, ideology, and fear. The new year in the Soviet Union was not merely celebrated, it was managed. To understand how Soviet leaders celebrated, you have to start with what they inherited. The Russian Empire had long treated Christmas as the emotional center of winter, wrapped in Orthodox tradition and monarchy-era social hierarchy. The Bolsheviks, who seized power in Petrograd in October 1917, did not simply overthrow a government. They declared war on the old calendar of meaning. Religion, private property, and bourgeois domestic rituals were all suspect. The early Soviet state tried to replace sacred time with revolutionary time. Anniversaries of uprisings, party congresses, May Day, and the October Revolution became the true holidays of the New World. In that ideological environment, New Year's was awkward. It was not explicitly religious like Christmas, but it was adjacent to it, tied to family tables, gifts, and winter trees. The Bolsheviks did not need New Year's to govern, and in the harsh years of civil war and famine, they barely had the resources to pretend otherwise. Vladimir Lenin embodied that early severity. In the years when the Soviet state was fighting for survival against the whites, against foreign intervention, against economic breakdown, Lenin's relationship to holidays was pragmatic. He was not known for grand feasting in the Kremlin. He usually worked through the New Year period because the revolution did not pause, and more importantly, because the machinery he was building depended on constant pressure. The Soviet state's early decisions were communism, grain requisitioning, the creation of the Cheka, the suppression of political rivals were not the actions of a government that could afford sentimental breaks. The consequences were immense: mass coercion in the countryside, a militarized economy, and a political culture in which the leaders' personal habits reinforced the message that the state's mission outweighed private life. And yet even Lenin, especially at the end, could not entirely escape the human dimension of the season. After a series of strokes beginning in 1922, Lenin spent much of his final period away from the center of power, at the estate in Gorky outside Moscow. It was there, in the last years of his life, that he began hosting modest New Year gatherings. He invited children from neighboring villages. The gifts were not lavish small candies and simple lumps of sugar, the kind of offering that speaks volumes about the time. Scarcity was not an abstract concept in the early 1920s. It was a daily reality shaped by policy choices and catastrophe. The famine of 1921-1922, triggered by drought and exacerbated by requisitions and disruption, killed millions. Even after Lenin introduced the new economic policy in 1921 to stabilize the economy by allowing limited market mechanisms, the country remained battered. In that context, a few sweets for village children were both a personal gesture and an unintentional documentary detail. The leader of a revolutionary state, physically diminished, marking the year's turn not with a spectacle of power, but with a small, almost private attempt at normality. Lenin died in January 1924, and with his death, the Soviet leadership entered a new era in which rituals mattered differently. Joseph Stalin's rise was not just a political victory, it was the construction of a system in which the leader's persona became an institution. Stalin understood the value of controlled celebration. Under him, New Year's could be turned into a demonstration of abundance in a society that had endured hunger, of unity in a party that had been purged, of joy in a country where joy could be dangerous if it wasn't sanctioned. Stalin's New Year celebrations often took place with large feasts in the Moscow Kremlin. The setting itself was a statement. The Kremlin was not merely a workplace, it was the fortress of the state, the symbolic heart of Soviet authority. To feast, there was to remind everyone present that they were inside the inner sanctum, dependent on proximity to the leader. These were not casual dinners. Performers would appear on a stage in front of Stalin's desk, an arrangement that captured the hierarchy of the Stalinist world in physical form. The leader remained seated at his desk, the center of gravity, while art and entertainment were deployed as instruments of atmosphere and loyalty. After the performances, those same performers might be invited to share wine with him. In a system where an invitation could mean favor and exclusion could mean ruin, even a toast carried political weight. These Kremlin feasts existed alongside Stalin's more intimate home gatherings with close relatives and trusted comrades. The distinction mattered. Stalin's dictatorship functioned through layers: public ceremonies of the state, internal rituals of the party, and private tests of loyalty among a narrow circle. At his home gatherings, the atmosphere could be less formal, but no less charged. There are documented accounts of figures like Marshal Semyon Budyonny, a celebrated cavalry commander of the Civil War and a symbol of military tradition in the Soviet pantheon, entertaining Stalin by playing the accordion. That detail is revealing. Budyonny was not just a friend. He was a living emblem of the revolution's violent birth, a man whose fame had been cultivated by the state. His presence at a New Year gathering was a reminder that the regime's legitimacy rested on memories of victory and force. Alcohol was central to these occasions, but even here Stalin's habits were carefully observed and interpreted. The table could hold a range of drinks, including Stalin's favored Georgian wine, Kh-Vanchkara, a natural semi-sweet red associated with his native region. Georgian cuisine and wine were part of Stalin's personal brand, a way of projecting earthy authenticity and cultural confidence. Yet Stalin often drank plain water, poured from a separate decanter. In the Stalinist environment, that was not a neutral quirk. It reinforced his image as the man in control, the one who watched while others loosened their tongues. In a political culture built on surveillance and denunciation, intoxication was risk. The leader staying sober while others drank was not merely personal preference, it was power performed as restraint. To see why Stalin's New Year mattered, you have to place it against the larger arc of his rule. The 1930s were years of forced collectivization, industrialization at breakneck speed, and mass terror. The Great Purge of 1937-1938, carried out through NKVD operations and party expulsions, destroyed a significant portion of the Soviet elite and traumatized society. In such a climate, celebration in the Kremlin was not an escape from politics, it was politics by other means. The state projected a narrative of progress and happiness: new factories, new cities, heroic workers, while millions lived under fear. A lavish table and staged entertainment in the Kremlin did not disprove the terror, it helped mask it, and it reminded the elite that their survival depended on participation in the leader's world. The Second World War, known in the USSR as the Great Patriotic War, intensified the symbolic stakes of New Year. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on 22 June 1941, the state confronted an existential crisis. Moscow itself was threatened by autumn. By New Year's 1941-1942, the war had already demanded staggering losses. In that context, the Soviet leadership's seasonal rituals could not be purely indulgent. They were tied to morale and the projection of endurance. The Soviet state used holidays to reinforce the message that life continued, that the nation was unbroken. The war years also reinforced the centrality of the Kremlin as a command center, where decisions about offensives, production quotas, and alliances were made. Any gathering there, including New Year, existed under the shadow of casualty lists and frontline reports. After 1945, Stalin's last years brought a different kind of tension. Victory did not soften the system, it hardened it in new ways. The early Cold War, beginning almost immediately after the defeat of Nazi Germany, transformed Soviet leadership culture into one of constant strategic suspicion. The Berlin blockade of 1948-1949, the formation of NATO in 1949, the Soviet atomic bomb test in 1949, and the Korean War beginning in 1950 all formed the backdrop of Stalin's final period. New Year gatherings among the elite were now held in a world where global confrontation was becoming permanent. The leaders' table was still a place of ritual, but the conversations around it, carefully chosen, carefully performed, took place in a state that had moved from revolutionary survival to superpower rivalry. Stalin died in March 1953, and the Soviet leadership entered a period of uncertainty that would ultimately elevate Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev's New Year style marked a shift not only in personality but in political strategy. Khrushchev was a product of the Stalin system, but he also sought to dismantle parts of it, especially the cult that had made Stalin untouchable. His famous secret speech at the 20th Party Congress in February 1956 condemned Stalin's abuses and initiated de-Stalinization. That was not an abstract moral correction. It was a power move with consequences across the Eastern Bloc, contributing to uprisings and instability, including the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 and the Soviet decision to crush it. Khrushchev's leadership required a different kind of legitimacy. He needed to appear energetic, accessible, and future-oriented. Even his holiday rituals reflected that. Khrushchev introduced a fashion of celebrating New Year at work among colleagues, and in his case, work meant the Kremlin as a functioning political and administrative space rather than a throne room. He invited specialists from various fields to these gatherings. That detail matters because it aligns with Khrushchev's broader approach. He often emphasized expertise, production, agriculture, and technological competition with the West. This was the era of the Virgin Lands Campaign, launched in 1954 to boost grain output by cultivating vast areas in Kazakhstan and Siberia. It was also the era in which the USSR sought prestige through science and space, culminating in the launch of Sputnik in October 1957. Khrushchev's New Year feasts, where he summarized work and made plans for the future, were consistent with a leader who framed politics as a series of campaigns and targets. The holiday became an extension of the planning mentality, a ceremonial checkpoint in the march of the five-year plans. Yet Khrushchev's celebrations were not simply technocratic. They were also about control through sociability. He personally ensured that guests at the table drank constantly. In a leadership culture shaped by Stalin's suspicion, alcohol could still function as a tool loosening tongues, testing loyalties, forcing participation. What makes Khrushchev's approach especially telling is the documented fact that he used a double-bottomed shot glass that held very little alcohol. In other words, he pushed others to drink while keeping his own intake limited. The technique echoed Stalin's habit of drinking water while others consumed wine, but the style was different. Stalin's restraint was silent and intimidating. Khrushchev's was boisterous, almost theatrical. Both produced the same structural effect. The leader remained comparatively clear-headed, while the room became more vulnerable. Khrushchev's era was also one of high-risk confrontation. The Berlin Crisis of 1950, 81961, the construction of the Berlin Wall in August 1961, and the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 defined the period. Decisions taken by Khrushchev and his circle could bring the world to the edge of nuclear war. In that context, the leader's New Year table with specialists, with plans, with forced camaraderie was not a harmless tradition. It was part of how the Soviet elite managed itself under stress. By reaffirming hierarchy, by performing unity, by turning the holiday into a controlled environment where the future was spoken aloud as if it could be commanded. Khrushchev was removed from power in October 1964, replaced by a collective leadership that soon came to be associated above all with Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev's approach to New Year celebrations reflected the political mood of his time: stability, predictability, and the careful packaging of Soviet life as orderly and normal. Brezhnev promoted the idea that New Year's is a family holiday. Under him, the boisterous feasts in the Moscow Kremlin ceased. That was not a trivial change in etiquette. It was an ideological adjustment. The Brezhnev era, often described as a period of stagnation, was characterized by a leadership that valued control through routine. After the volatility of the Khrushchev years' rapid reforms, dramatic reversals, public embarrassment, Brezhnev's system sought to reassure the elite and the population that shocks would be minimized. Brezhnev's own celebrations were typically at home or at his dacha, surrounded by family and close friends. There, he danced, reminisced, and sang war songs, and the gatherings could continue intermittently until January 2. Those details paint a picture of a leader who cultivated a particular kind of legitimacy, not the revolutionary asceticism of Lenin, not the terror-backed grandeur of Stalin, not the campaign-driven exuberance of Khrushchev, but the image of a wartime veteran presiding over a settled, domesticated superpower. Brezhnev's public persona leaned heavily on the memory of the Great Patriotic War, a memory that under his rule became an increasingly central pillar of Soviet identity. War songs at a New Year gathering were not random nostalgia. They were a reaffirmation of the founding myth of post-war Soviet society, that the USSR had saved civilization at immense cost and therefore deserved respect, security, and stability. Even Brezhnev's drinking habits fit the message. He limited his alcohol consumption to Soviet champagne and the bitter liqueur Zubrovka. Champagne on New Year's was itself a cultural signal. By the late Soviet period, Soviet champagne had become a mass-market symbol of celebration, a standardized product meant to make the holiday feel modern and shared across a vast country. When the leader drank it, he mirrored what millions of Soviet families were trying to do at their own tables, create a moment of brightness in a system that often felt gray. The fact that Kremlin feasts diminished under Brezhnev also aligned with the broader media strategy of the era. The Soviet state increasingly presented leadership as collective, disciplined, and respectable. A leader who insisted New Year's was for family helped Project Normalcy, and normalcy was a political asset when the economy was slowing and the system's promises were becoming harder to fulfill. But Soviet leaders did not celebrate in a vacuum. Their private rituals intersected with the public choreography of the holiday across the USSR, and that public choreography was itself a political project. New Year's became the major winter holiday in part because the Soviet state needed a secular alternative to Christmas that could be celebrated widely without empowering the church. Over time, the New Year tree, Ded Moroz, and gift-giving were normalized as Soviet tradition, especially after the mid-1930s, when the regime permitted New Year trees again as part of a controlled, state-friendly festivity. By the post-war decades, the holiday had become a national ritual that linked families in cramped apartments, workers in dormitories, and soldiers on duty. The leadership's approach influenced the tone. Under Stalin, the holiday could feel like a performance staged by a state that demanded happiness. Under Khrushchev, it could feel like a mobilization, a toast to targets and plans. Under Brezhnev, it was encouraged as domestic comfort, a pause that did not threaten the political order. The contrast between leaders is striking because it mirrors the evolution of Soviet governance. Lenin's work through the holiday posture belonged to a revolutionary state improvising under siege. Stalin's feasts in the Kremlin belonged to a dictatorship that fused spectacle with fear and that used intimacy as a weapon. Khrushchev's work-centered celebrations belonged to a regime trying to re-legitimize itself after terror by promising progress and competing with the West in living standards and technology. Brezhnev's family holiday message belonged to a system that prioritized stability and avoided extremes, even as it drifted into economic and political inertia. Each style had consequences beyond the table. Stalin's era institutionalized a culture where proximity to the leader was everything, where social rituals were politically dangerous, and where the state could demand not only obedience but emotional performance. Khrushchev's era loosened some of the terror but retained the leader's dominance, replacing fear with volatility and pressure, and his ritualized gatherings with specialists echoed his faith that the system could be pushed into success through willpower and targets. Brezhnev's era made the leadership seem less capricious, but the very domestication of power also concealed decay. When leaders stop throwing grand feasts in the Kremlin and start singing familiar songs at the dacha, it can mean society is stabilizing, or it can mean the system has run out of new stories to tell. By the late Soviet period, the New Year address and the synchronized midnight rituals across time zones became part of the state's emotional infrastructure, binding the country together for a few minutes of shared expectation. Even when people distrusted official propaganda, the holiday retained its force because it offered something the system rarely provided: a private space that felt legitimate. Families could build their own meaning around the state-approved celebration. That was a compromise between ideology and human need, and it had been shaped, decade by decade, by the example set at the top. The deeper truth is that Soviet leaders celebrated New Year the way they governed, Lenin with utilitarian focus and late, modest gestures, Stalin with controlled abundance and watchful restraint, Khrushchev with performative camaraderie and managerial ambition, Brezhnev with curated normalcy and nostalgia. The holiday became a mirror of the state's evolving contract with its people, what it demanded, what it permitted, and what it pretended to provide. Today, when post-Soviet societies still treat New Year as the central winter celebration, when televised addresses and midnight rituals remain politically charged, the legacy of those Soviet decades is still visible. The USSR tried to reshape time itself, to replace religious calendars with state calendars, and it succeeded in at least one way. It made a secular New Year into a national event powerful enough to outlive the system that engineered it. But the way the leaders marked that moment also left another inheritance, harder to celebrate, a reminder that even the most intimate rituals can be drafted into service by power, and that in a highly centralized state, the private life of the ruler is never just private. It becomes a signal, a warning, and sometimes a blueprint for how an entire society is expected to feel when the clock strikes midnight.